Hey, this is Dave from GMAT Ninja. Today I'm going to talk to you about what you can expect from working with a good one-on-one GMAT tutor. And I'm going to do that by walking you through our process at GMAT Ninja, and by sharing a story about one of my former students named Amy. When she came to us, Amy had gotten a 420 on her most recent official exam with a 6 on the verbal. She ended up with a 700 and a 40 on the verbal. Now, Amy was a unique case, both in terms of how much she was struggling and how dramatically her score ultimately improved. But I hope our work together can show that a tutor can go beyond simply teaching rules and concepts and address the underlying problems that are holding you back from achieving your goal score. So today, I'm going to talk you through 4 steps that you could take to make sure that you're getting the most out of working with your GMAT tutor. First, diagnose your problems. Second, make a plan to address those problems. Third, track your results and rebuild your habits. And fourth, test your practice with a practice test. If we're going to help a student, we have to diagnose the problems that are holding her back. Most students think we're just going to tell them what to do or what to learn. In reality, the first thing we do is to watch you so that we can identify your bad habits and come up with strategies to address them. This initial diagnosis can be either a practice exam, sets in targeted areas, or some combination of the two. This allows us to see what kinds of questions you're missing and how long those questions are taking you. Our second form of diagnosis is observing you in real time. This lets us see where you're going astray. If you miss a question, the problem could be some kind of gap in your knowledge or understanding, or maybe anxiety is undermining your thought process. The issue could also be poor test-taking technique. A few basic examples of poor technique are rushing through a passage without understanding the logical structure, paraphrasing a passage in your own words and missing key details, or maybe it's just as simple as failing to check your work on an arithmetic question. When I watched Amy do a reading comprehension passage, I could see that she had issues with anxiety and technique. First, she would read the passage as quickly as she could. Then, she would jump to the answer choices before she'd understood the logical structure of what she'd read. Then, when analyzing answer choices, Amy tended to cling to the first answer choice that sounded right, so Amy was falling for traps almost every single time. Based on what we see from this initial diagnosis, we'll come up with a concrete plan for what you need to study and how you need to practice. Filling knowledge gaps is pretty straightforward. If, for example, you struggled with parallelism and sentence correction, you could always read a book or watch a video or get some direct help from your tutor. Most students have some kind of knowledge gap, but that's usually not the biggest issue holding them back. Anxiety and poor technique are more often the issue, and they're harder to fix. To address them, we'll need to dig in and identify the specific habits and triggers that are holding you back, and then come up with a personal checklist of things you can do to help with these problems while you're doing practice questions. Now, as I said earlier, Amy didn't have any issues with her foundational knowledge. So to help her deal with her anxiety and technique issues, I had her incorporate 3 simple behavioral changes. First, anytime a problem made her unusually anxious, I'd have her do a breathing exercise. Inhale to the count of 4, hold for the count of 4, and then exhale to the count of 8. Next, we made sure that Amy never looked at the answer choices until she understood the passage in the author's own words. This often meant rereading lines, jotting notes to capture the specific language of a conclusion, or taking an additional moment to process what she'd read before going to the answer choices. Last, we made it a rule that she was never allowed to select an option until she'd evaluated all 5 answer choices and had a concrete reason for eliminating 4 of them. This stopped her from falling into the most common traps that the question writers had set. Next, we want to track your results and rebuild your habits. This is often the hardest part of the process. You might think that once we figured out where you're going astray, the problem's been solved. In reality, habits are incredibly difficult to change. Even after a breakthrough during a session, you might go right back to doing whatever it was you were doing before we started working together. And this makes sense. If you do something one way for years, a single 2-hour session is not going to rewire your brain. So we change habits by assigning a lot of homework, an average of 15 hours per week. And at first, We won't assign any practice tests. We need to see real progress in the homework data first. We'll track the results of your problem sets in a shared spreadsheet. It can take several weeks or longer before we see lasting improvement. Once we have the data from that homework, here's how we track progress. First, we look at the questions you missed in each problem set. Second, we look for inconsistent timing across sets. If you seem to be a different student from one set to the next, we have to figure out why. Third, we listen to what you think you're doing well and doing poorly on, and then confirm whether your perception is accurate. Oftentimes, students will report that their technique has improved, but this is contradicted by the homework data. Then we push our students to incorporate every adjustment we've talked about. We'll ask them to do a set of questions, and we'll assess whether they followed every item on their personalized checklist. Did you reread every question? Did you use your anti-anxiety technique every time you got rattled? Did you make sure that you understood the structure of the passage before going to the answer choices? These are the kinds of things that have to change every time you practice, or you're not going to see improvement on test day. If my student isn't making improvements, then I'll dive in and try to figure out why they're not making these adjustments when I'm not around. Because the ultimate goal is to render your tutor obsolete. Going back to my work with Amy, for the first 2 weeks, her results didn't change that much. When we reviewed incorrect answers from her homework, we both realized that she was slipping back into her old bad habits. In other words, she's human. After identifying the problems, I assigned more homework and had her be extra mindful this time to make sure that she was sticking to her checklist. Eventually, at around week 3 or 4, she started to make real progress, and all of the adjustments we talked about were starting to become second nature. Once we see that behavior has really changed, and we're seeing promising results in the practice sets, then we'll move on to practice tests. Sometimes we see an immediate score improvement, and other times we discover there are still more issues to iron out. The reason is that certain challenges are unique to the test. In a high-stakes test environment, you might have a gnawing sense that you're behind on time, and this can lead to careless errors that you wouldn't necessarily make on the homework. And because the test is adaptive, it's going to become more difficult if you're doing well, so you're going to have to let go of some harder questions. Or we might just find some content issue that we hadn't realized was there and that we'll need to shore up. Amy's early practice tests, not surprisingly, were well short of her goal score. She was so anxious about falling behind on time that she'd rushed throughout the exam, causing her technique to break down even on questions that shouldn't have been too difficult for her. Because the GMAT punishes you more for missing an easier question than for missing a harder question, the easy questions Amy was missing were having a disproportionately negative impact on her score. If she could keep her accuracy up throughout the test, it wouldn't matter as much if she ran out of time and missed a few at the end. After a few more weeks of practicing these adjustments, she was still running out of time, but her verbal score was now in the high 30s or low 40s, and she was finally breaking 700. And so, Amy's story ultimately has a happy ending. She went from a 6 to a 40 on the verbal and hit 700 on the nose. On top of that, she recently called me to tell me that she'd been admitted by an Ivy League MBA program and they gave her a scholarship too. Now, going from 6 to 40 is hardly typical, but it does show that if you're willing to put in the time and the effort to change the habits that are holding you back, pretty amazing things are possible. I'm Dave from GMAT Ninja. Thanks so much for watching.